Britain's greatest general didn't die on the battlefield. He killed himself in Paris. Why? He was gay. When his relationships with young men in Ceylon were exposed, the British establishment refused a public trial. Instead, they backed him into a corner, using his own suicide to bury his same-sex affairs forever. But long before he became the empire's darkest secret, he was a nobody. Hector Archibald Macdonald was born in 1853 to a poor Scottish tenant farmer. 19th century class structures destined him for a life of obscure, back-breaking labor. The Victorian military was an aristocratic fortress where officers simply bought their ranks. Men like Macdonald were meant to die in the trenches. Yet in 1870, the 17-year-old enlisted as a private. He didn't buy his leadership. He earned it in blood. His rise was unprecedented. During the First Boer War, his reckless courage at the disastrous Battle of Majuba Hill earned him a rare field promotion, sending shockwaves through the elite officer corps. He later commanded troops in the Sudan with cold, precise discipline. At Omdurman in 1898, his brilliant tactics saved the British forces. He repeated this at Paardeberg in 1900. The dirt-poor farm boy had transformed into a military icon. Queen Victoria knighted him. Promoted to Major General, he became the ultimate symbol of working-class triumph. To survive this elite, judgmental world, Macdonald forged an iron exterior. To the public, he was a stoic bachelor wedded only to the empire. He even kept a marriage completely hidden to maintain his solitary mystique. The public revered him, but Victorian society was deeply hypocritical. It was an era paralyzed by moral panic, where the line between glory and ruin was razor thin. In 1885, the Labouchere Amendment criminalized all homosexual acts. The law demanded absolute conformity. It became a weapon to control powerful men, and it was waiting for Macdonald. In 1902, the British appointed Macdonald as commander of their forces in Ceylon, now Sri Lanka. He arrived as a living monument. However, within months, insidious whispers began to crack his armor. Horrifying rumors circulated in the colonial clubs and drawing rooms. These were not just accusations of homosexuality. They were dark allegations of sexual relations with young local Sinhalese boys and the teenage sons of British officials. The turning point came when a 16-year-old boy came forward. He drafted a damning letter accusing the Major General of sexually abusing him and his 13-year-old brother. Modern historical research suggests this was not just a smear campaign born of class resentment. The evidence points to a systemic pattern of child sexual abuse. For the British administration, this was a massive crisis. A highly decorated general was preying on the youth of the colony he was meant to protect. This threatened to destroy the illusion of British moral superiority. The governor of Ceylon, Sir Joseph West Ridgway, recognized the danger. He summoned Macdonald to a tense private meeting. The governor informed him the accusations were too substantial to ignore. There were reportedly over 70 potential witnesses. Macdonald was ordered to return to London immediately to face a public court-martial. However, the underlying message was clear. A trial would destroy the pristine image of the British Army. The system forcefully suggested he find a gentleman's solution. They wanted an honorable exit to spare the empire a humiliating public reckoning. Macdonald sailed back to Europe. Stripped of his command, he stopped in Paris in March 1903. He checked into the Hotel Regina. Any hope of quietly resolving the matter vanished when he read the Paris edition of the New York Herald. The story had leaked. Headlines screamed of grave charges and immoral acts. They explicitly linked his sudden departure from Ceylon to unspeakable crimes. Holding the newspaper, Macdonald realized he was out of time. The Empire had abandoned him. A court-martial would drag his name through the mud and shatter his legacy. On the morning of March 25, 1903, the seasoned commander made his final decision. Isolated in his hotel room, Hector Macdonald picked up a Browning pistol. He pressed it to his head and pulled the trigger. The gunshot ended his life and shocked the British Empire. The military had let him travel unescorted. This was a glaring departure from standard protocol for a man facing such grave charges. They had deliberately given him the time and distance to kill himself. They forced a suicide to prevent public exposure. The British government scrambled to contain the fallout. They orchestrated a quiet, rushed burial to suppress the scandal. But the ugly truth eventually surfaced. Macdonald became Scotland's most contentious fallen hero. His story exposes the brutal mechanics of Imperial reputation management. He conquered the world's most terrifying battlefields, only to be destroyed by his own dark flaws and the merciless expectations of the society he served. Yet in June of 1870, at the age of 17, Macdonald made a decision that would alter the trajectory of the empire. He walked away from the plow and enlisted as a private in the 92nd Gordon Highlanders. The Victorian Army for an enlisted man was an institution of brutal, dehumanizing discipline. Floggings, grueling labor, and absolute subjugation were daily realities. Macdonald, however, viewed this brutal system as a mechanism for his own advancement. He possessed a terrifying singular willpower. Where other men broke under the relentless drills and the cruelty of the sergeants, Macdonald hardened into steel. He embraced the rigid structure, weaponizing the discipline forced upon him. He became the perfect soldier, silent, precise, fiercely intelligent, and entirely devoid of the indiscipline that plagued the lower ranks. He climbed the non-commissioned ladder with methodical speed, corporal, sergeant, and eventually color sergeant. By the time he was deployed to the Second Anglo-Afghan War in 1879, he was already known not as a comrade, but as a fearsome enforcer of order. He survived ambushes, grueling marches through hostile terrain, and the constant threat of disease, catching the eyes of his commanders for his cold, calculating efficiency under fire. But a color sergeant was the absolute ceiling for a man of his birth. To go higher, to cross the threshold into the officer corps, required aristocratic blood and a heavy purse. It took a catastrophe of imperial proportions to shatter that glass ceiling, and that catastrophe occurred on a steep, rocky summit in South Africa, known as Majuba Hill. By 1881, the British Empire was engaged in the First Boer War, facing a highly mobile, fiercely independent enemy that they had fatally underestimated. Unlike the poorly armed forces the British were accustomed to fighting, the Boers were expert marksmen. They were seasoned hunters who moved quickly with devastating tactical fluidity. In late February, Major General Sir George Pomeroy Colley made a catastrophic tactical blunder. Desperate for a decisive victory, he marched a mixed force of British infantry up the treacherous slopes of Majuba Hill under the cover of darkness. Exhausted by the climb, the men reached the summit, and in a fatal display of arrogance, Colley ordered them to rest without digging defensive trenches or establishing proper perimeters. Looking down at the Boer camps in the valleys below, the British command believed they held an impregnable position. They were wrong. The Boers did not retreat. They counterattacked, utilizing the dead ground and the steep, rocky terrain to mask their advance. Groups of Boer riflemen systematically picked off the British defenders, outlined against the skyline. The British forces, trained to fight in rigid lines on open ground, were completely unequipped for this precise, invisible slaughter. As the Boer marksmen closed in, panic began to infect the British ranks. The command structure disintegrated. Officers fell one by one, culminating in Major General Colley himself being killed by a shot to the head. What was supposed to be a strategic stronghold turned into a chaotic, bloody slaughterhouse. The British line shattered, and soldiers threw down their weapons, turning to flee in a frantic, terrifying rout down the side of the mountain. Amidst this total collapse of Imperial discipline, Color Sergeant Hector Macdonald refused to run. Commanding a small, isolated detachment of Highlanders, he held a critical ridge as the rest of the army disintegrated around him. As the Boers swarmed their position, Macdonald's men ran out of ammunition. In the face of certain death, surrender was the only logical option. Macdonald chose violence. He led his surviving men in a desperate, savage hand-to-hand defense against the advancing rifles. He fought with the ferocity of a cornered predator, using rifle butts, bayonets, rocks, and his bare fists. He struck down the enemy with a relentless, terrifying rage that shocked even the hardened Boer commandos. He held his ground until he was physically overwhelmed, beaten down, and finally taken prisoner amidst the corpses of his men. The Boers were furious at the casualties this single Scottish sergeant had inflicted upon them in the final moments of the battle. Many demanded his immediate execution, but the Boer commander, General Pierre Joubert, stepped forward. Joubert had witnessed the defense. He recognized that he was looking at a warrior of unparalleled caliber. In a profound gesture of martial respect that would soon become Imperial legend, Joubert intervened, saved Macdonald's life, and returned the sergeant's confiscated sword to him, stating that a man who fought so bravely should not be stripped of his weapon. The Battle of Majuba Hill was a humiliating, devastating defeat for the British Empire. But Hector Macdonald's last stand provided the military press with a desperately needed narrative of absolute heroism. When General Sir Frederick Roberts took command of the forces in South Africa shortly after, he reviewed the dispatches regarding the disastrous battle. The reports of Macdonald's superhuman stand stood out starkly against the backdrop of cowardice and tactical failure. Roberts summoned the color sergeant. He presented Macdonald with a choice that would define the rest of his life. He could receive the Victoria Cross, the highest military decoration for gallantry, or he could accept a field commission and become an officer. Macdonald chose the commission. He was appointed as a second lieutenant in the Gordon Highlanders. With that single decision, he crossed the most heavily guarded social boundary in the British Empire. He had achieved the impossible, but in doing so, he had sealed his own tragic fate. By becoming an officer, Macdonald entered a world that fundamentally despised him. He was a ranker, a man who had risen from the dirt, thrust into the officers' mess alongside men who possessed private incomes, polo ponies, and elite boarding school pedigrees. They viewed his presence as an insult to their aristocratic exclusivity. He could not afford their lavish lifestyles, he did not share their social language, and he possessed none of their political connections. He was entirely isolated, surrounded by peers who waited eagerly for him to fail, to prove that the lower classes were unfit for command. Macdonald realized instantly that bravery was no longer enough. To survive in this hostile upper-class ecosystem, his armor had to be completely flawless. He could never show weakness, he could never ask for help, and he could never make a mistake. His only currency was lethal, undeniable competence on the battlefield, and a cold, impenetrable stoicism in his personal life. He had fought his way out of the mud of poverty, but he had arrived in a gilded cage where he would be scrutinized, alienated, and forced to play a role perfectly for the rest of his life, until the weight of that performance eventually crushed him. The transition from a hardened, mud-soaked sergeant to a commissioned officer was arguably the most perilous battlefield Hector Macdonald had ever faced. In the officer's mess, a man's worth was measured not by the calluses on his hands or the blood on his bayonet, but by his pedigree, his private income, and his mastery of an intricate, unwritten social code. Macdonald possessed none of these. He was a spectacular anomaly, a man who spoke with the thick, unrefined burr of the Scottish Highlands, sitting among men who had been groomed at Eton and Sandhurst. They scrutinized his every move, his table manners, his uniform, waiting for the inevitable moment when the peasant would reveal his true nature. To survive this silent, suffocating hostility, Macdonald constructed an impenetrable fortress around his persona. He became more strictly disciplined than the aristocrats who commanded him. He stripped away any semblance of vulnerability, presenting the world with a stoic, emotionless facade of absolute military perfection. If they were going to judge him, he would give them absolutely nothing to criticize. This relentless pursuit of perfection drove him out of the comfortable garrisons of Britain and into the most brutal theaters of the empire. He knew that his only true sanctuary was the battlefield, where competence overshadowed class. He spent the next decade relentlessly campaigning in Egypt and the Sudan, proving his worth in the scorching, disease-ridden sands where aristocratic officers frequently perished or broke down. It was here, in the unforgiving theater of the modest war, that he caught the eye of Major General Horatio Herbert Kitchener. Kitchener was an aristocrat to his core, a cold, calculating architect of war who viewed men merely as instruments of imperial will. Yet Kitchener recognized in Macdonald a kindred spirit of ruthless efficiency. He saw a man who understood the mechanics of violence and discipline from the ground up. The defining moment of Macdonald's career, the crucible that would forever cement his myth as a towering national hero, arrived on the morning of September 2nd, 1898, at the Battle of Omdurman. Kitchener had marched a massive Anglo-Egyptian army deep into the Sudan to crush the Mahdist forces once and for all. As the sun rose over the desert, tens of thousands of Mahdist warriors charged the British lines. For most of the morning, it was a slaughter, as British Maxim machine guns mowed down the charging forces with mechanical efficiency. Believing the battle won, Kitchener ordered his army to advance toward the city of Omdurman, but it was a fatal miscalculation. Kitchener had failed to realize that a massive, fresh Mahdist force had remained hidden behind a ridge, waiting for the British lines to stretch and fracture. As the British forces moved out, Macdonald's Sudanese brigade was left exposed and isolated on the far right flank. Suddenly, over 3,000 Mahdist warriors crested the ridge, bearing down directly on Macdonald's solitary brigade. If his line broke, the enemy would sweep into the exposed flank of the entire British army, turning a triumph into one of the greatest military disasters in Imperial history. This is the exact moment where the difference between an aristocrat who read about war and a ranker who lived it became violently apparent. A lesser commander would have panicked, ordered a desperate retreat, or called frantically for reinforcements that would never arrive in time. Macdonald did none of those things. Sitting calmly on his horse while enemy fire filled the air, he relied on the very thing that had saved him at Majuba Hill: absolute, unwavering discipline. He began barking orders, treating the chaotic battlefield exactly like the drill squares of his youth. With thousands of warriors screaming toward them, Macdonald executed a series of complex, perilous tactical maneuvers. He ordered his men to change front, pivoting lines of infantry under heavy fire to form a defensive arc. He moved his battalions as if they were pieces on a chessboard, anticipating the enemy's movements with lethal precision. When a second, entirely separate modest force appeared from another direction to attack his rear, Macdonald didn't flinch. He simply pivoted his men again, creating a perfect, unbroken wall of fire that decimated the charging waves. He held the line single-handedly until the rest of the British forces could turn back to support him. He had saved Kitchener's army from annihilation. When the dust of Omdurman settled, the name Hector Macdonald echoed across the globe. He was no longer just an officer. He was Fighting Mac, the undisputed savior of the Sudan. The British public, hungry for heroes who represented the grit of the common man, elevated him to the status of a living god. When he returned to Scotland, he was greeted by crowds so massive and hysterical that the streets of Edinburgh and Glasgow were rendered impassable. He was mobbed by adoring citizens, knighted by Queen Victoria, and treated as the absolute pinnacle of Victorian manhood. But this staggering public adoration masked a deeply fragmented and isolated private life. The tragic irony of Hector Macdonald was that the more the world worshipped him, the more he had to hide. The public demanded a specific narrative, the solitary, married to the army warrior monk who sacrificed all personal desire for the glory of the empire. To deviate from this narrative was to risk losing everything he had fought so brutally to build. Therefore, he buried his personal life in absolute secrecy. In 1884, years before his rise to global fame, Macdonald had secretly married a woman named Christina McDuncan. She was a woman of modest background, and their union was entirely incompatible with the social expectations placed upon a rising star in the officer corps. An officer was expected to marry a woman of proper breeding who could host dinners, charm generals, and navigate the treacherous social waters of the elite. Christina could do none of these things, and bringing her into the light would have invited the very aristocratic scorn Macdonald was desperate to avoid. So, he simply hid her. They saw each other only during his rare clandestine visits to Britain. They eventually had a son, but to the outside world, Fighting Mac remained the stoic, unattached bachelor. This profound isolation took a psychological toll that no monument or medal could heal. He was a man deeply alienated from the ruling class he served, entirely disconnected from the working class he had left behind, and fundamentally unable to live a truthful life even in his own home. He existed solely within the suffocating confines of his own legend. As the years passed, the armor he had worn for so long began to fuse to his skin, becoming heavy, exhausting, and brittle. His physical body also began to mirror his internal exhaustion. During the Second Boer War, he once again led from the front at the Battle of Paardeberg, sustaining a severe gunshot wound to the foot. He refused to leave the battlefield until victory was secured, a testament to his legendary endurance, but the injury left him with a permanent limp and chronic pain. By the dawn of the 20th century, the invincible Fighting Mac was a tired, isolated man, carrying the impossible expectations of an entire empire on his fracturing shoulders. It was in this state of physical and emotional fatigue that he received his next major assignment. In early 1902, he was appointed as the commander of British forces in Ceylon. On paper, it appeared to be a reward for decades of grueling combat. Ceylon was a jewel of the empire, a lush tropical colony far removed from the blood and mud of South Africa or the Sudan. It was supposed to be a comfortable, prestigious posting where a war-weary general could enjoy the fruits of his labor. But colonial Ceylon was not a sanctuary. It was an incredibly insular, incestuous, and fiercely gossipy society. It was ruled by a tight-knit community of wealthy British planters and aristocratic civil servants who had ample time to scrutinize one another. When Hector Macdonald stepped off the ship in Colombo, the capital of Ceylon, he was walking directly into a gilded trap. He was the most famous man on the island, a massive celebrity whose every movement would be watched, analyzed, and whispered about by a colonial elite who still, fundamentally, viewed him as a peasant who had overstepped his bounds. He had survived the Zulus, the Boers, and the modest warriors. He had no idea that the most lethal enemy he would ever face was the polite, whispering society of the British colonial administration and the darkest secrets of his own heart. When Hector Macdonald arrived in Colombo in the early months of 1902, the sheer physical reality of Ceylon must have felt like landing on another planet. The landscapes of his previous triumphs, the freezing, jagged rocks of South Africa, and the blinding, waterless expanses of the Sudan, were arenas of stark, unforgiving clarity. In the desert, a man's enemies were clearly defined, standing across a ridge with rifles in hand. Survival depended on physical endurance, tactical brilliance, and the swift application of violence. But Ceylon offered a completely different kind of suffocation. The air in Colombo was heavy, laden with relentless tropical humidity and the sweet, cloying scent of frangipani and rotting vegetation. It was a lush, vibrant island, but for a man accustomed to the austere discipline of military encampments, it was a gilded cage of paralyzing social protocols. The British colonial society in Ceylon was a microscopic, fiercely guarded ecosystem. It was populated by tea planters, civil servants, and the aristocratic second sons of the British elite. These were people who'd exported the rigid class hierarchies of Victorian London and amplified them under the tropical sun. Their lives revolved around the exclusive enclaves of the Colombo Club and the Hill Club in Nuwara Eliya, where the days were measured in rounds of golf, endless games of bridge, and polite, lethal gossip over gin and tonics. Into this delicate, fiercely snobbish environment stepped the most famous soldier in the empire, a man who still spoke with the rough, unpolished accent of a Highland crofter. Macdonald was fundamentally unequipped for this battlefield. He was a man of action, not of drawing-room diplomacy. He despised the frivolous chatter of the colonial elite and had no patience for the intricate social dances required of a high-ranking official in a peacetime posting. He found himself utterly isolated. The aristocratic officers beneath him resented his authority, viewing his low birth as an insult to their own status. They scrutinized his table manners, his lack of refined conversational skills, and his obvious discomfort in their presence. They were waiting for the peasant to stumble, eager to prove that courage on a battlefield did not equate to the breeding required to govern. Driven away by the thinly veiled hostility of the British expatriates, Macdonald began to withdraw from their exclusive circles. He sought out the company of those outside the rigid boundaries of the colonial elite. This is where the fatal miscalculations began, born perhaps out of profound loneliness, the crushing weight of his unacknowledged private life, or a dangerous sense of invulnerability that comes from surviving so much death. He began to associate with the local population, specifically the Burgher community, people of mixed Sri Lankan and European descent, and the native Sinhalese. He was frequently seen watching local schoolboys play sports, offering them rides in his official carriage, and inviting them into his private residence. In a modern context, a commanding officer taking a paternal interest in the local youth might be viewed with nuance, but in the paranoid, racially segregated, and morally rigid atmosphere of colonial Ceylon in 1902, it was a match struck in a powder magazine. The whispers began almost immediately. They started as raised eyebrows in the smoking rooms and muted conversations behind the sweeping verandas of the colonial mansions. The rumor was not merely that the great general was fraternizing below his station. It was far darker and more specific. The legal and social reality of the era made these rumors utterly terrifying. Only 7 years prior, the British public had watched with morbid fascination as the literary giant Oscar Wilde was utterly destroyed, imprisoned, and subjected to hard labor under the Labouchere Amendment for gross indecency. The colonial administration could tolerate a great deal of bad behavior from its leaders. Drunkenness, financial mismanagement, and brutality were frequently swept under the rug to protect the image of the empire, but crossing the line into pederasty, particularly involving the subjugated local population and the mixed-race sons of the colonial fringes, threatened to shatter the moral authority upon which the entire British occupation rested. The white ruling class justified their dominance by claiming moral superiority over the native populations. If their highest-ranking military hero was exposed as a predator preying on local children, the ideological foundation of the colony would collapse. For months, the situation existed as a toxic, unspoken tension. The elite whispered, but no one dared directly confront the hero of Omdurman. Macdonald, perhaps insulated by his own legend, either did not notice the gathering storm or arrogantly believed that his stellar military record made him untouchable. He continued his controversial associations, seemingly oblivious to the fact that his every movement was being tracked, cataloged, and discussed by people who actively wanted to see him destroyed. The breaking point arrived with a piece of paper. Rumors can be ignored, but written testimony demands action. Sometime in early 1903, the vague shadows of gossip solidified into concrete, actionable intelligence. A 16-year-old boy, the son of a respectable burgher family with ties to the colonial administration, came forward. The boy did not just complain to his parents. He, or someone acting on his behalf, drafted a detailed, explicit accusation. The boy alleged that Major General Macdonald had made improper advances and engaged in abusive behavior not only toward him, but also toward his 13-year-old brother. This intervention changed the dynamics entirely. Modern historical analysis of colonial archives paints a grim picture. This was no longer just homophobic persecution. The boy's letter provided specific dates, times, and locations. Furthermore, the boy indicated that they were not the only ones. There were dozens of others, including Sinhalese schoolboys and the sons of other colonial officials who had been subjected to the general's attentions. The Whisper Network suddenly became a list of over 70 potential witnesses. The accusation landed on the desk of Sir Joseph West Ridgway, the governor of Ceylon. Ridgway was a seasoned imperial bureaucrat, a man who understood that his primary duty was not the pursuit of absolute justice, but the protection of the empire's reputation. When he read the allegations, Ridgway knew he was holding a live grenade. If the local press, or worse, the international press, caught wind that the savior of the Sudan was abusing children in the colonies, The political fallout would be catastrophic. The fact that the accused was a working-class Scotsman who had penetrated the upper echelons of the military likely made Ridgway's decision easier. The aristocratic establishment had never truly accepted MacDonald. Now they had the perfect excuse to excise him from their ranks. Ridgway acted with swift, ruthless, bureaucratic efficiency. He did not order MacDonald's immediate arrest. To send police to drag a major general out of his residence in handcuffs would create a public spectacle, the very thing the administration was desperate to avoid. Instead, Ridgway summoned MacDonald to the governor's residence, Queen's House, for a private, off-the-record meeting. We can only imagine the suffocating tension in that room. The tea would have been served with pristine colonial etiquette. The ceiling fans would have cut through the humid air, and across a polished mahogany table, Governor Ridgway would have systematically dismantled the life of Hector Macdonald. Ridgway presented the accusations, not as questions to be answered, but as established facts that could no longer be contained. He informed the general of the letter, the specific ages of the boys, and the existence of the 70 witnesses waiting in the wings. MacDonald, the man who had faced thousands of charging warriors without breaking a sweat, suddenly found himself entirely defenseless. There was no enemy line to break, no tactical retreat to execute. He was trapped in a web of his own making, weaponized by a society that despised him. Ridgway laid out the brutal reality of the situation. MacDonald could not remain in Ceylon. He was relieved of his command effective immediately. But Ridgway did not stop there. He informed MacDonald that he was to return to London to face a general court-martial. However, the underlying, unspoken message of that meeting was the true death sentence. Ridgway, representing the combined will of the British establishment, was giving MacDonald a head start by allowing him to travel back to Europe unescorted, as a free man rather than a prisoner, under guard. The military was offering him a specific kind of colonial mercy. They were giving him the time, the space, and the isolation to recognize the impossibility of his situation. A court-martial would mean a very public, very humiliating trial, where the boys would testify, the newspapers would feast on the explicit details, and the name Fighting Mac would become synonymous with the worst kind of depravity. The system was implicitly demanding a final act of loyalty from the soldier. They were asking him to fall on his sword to save the empire the embarrassment of executing him. He was to take the long boat ride back to Europe, reflect upon the absolute destruction of his legacy, and find a gentleman's solution before he ever reached the shores of Britain. MacDonald left Queen's House a dead man walking. His career was over, his reputation was in severe jeopardy, and his mind must have been fracturing under the weight of impending public exposure. The armor he had spent a lifetime building had been shattered by a single letter from a teenage boy. He packed his belongings in silence, avoiding the eyes of his staff, and boarded a ship leaving Colombo. As the lush green coastline of Ceylon faded into the distance, MacDonald began a long, agonizing journey toward a final reckoning, carrying with him a secret so heavy it would soon require a bullet to silence. The voyage across the Indian Ocean and through the Suez Canal was a passage through purgatory. For weeks, Hector Macdonald was trapped aboard a steamship, a prisoner of the open water and his own collapsing reality. The physical environment of the ship offered a stark, agonizing contrast to the turmoil inside his mind. Around him, oblivious colonial administrators, tea merchants, and military families went about their leisurely routines, enjoying the sea breeze and the polite evening dinners. MacDonald walked among them like a ghost. He was still technically a major general, still bearing the knighthood bestowed upon him by a dead queen, but he knew with absolute certainty that he was returning to Europe as a condemned man. He spent his nights walking the wooden decks, listening to the rhythmic, mechanical churning of the ship's engines. In the darkness, staring out at the black expanse of the sea, the full weight of his isolation must have threatened to crush him. He was a man who had spent his entire adult life mastering the brutal, straightforward mathematics of war. On the battlefield, an enemy is visible. You can outflank them, you can outshoot them, you can break their will through sheer physical force and tactical brilliance. But how does a soldier fight a whisper? How does a man who knows only the language of gunpowder and discipline defend himself against allegations of profound moral corruption? He could not bayonet a rumor. He could not order an artillery barrage against the prejudices of the British establishment. The military machine that had forged him into a weapon of the empire was now systematically dismantling him to protect itself. The men he had served alongside, the aristocratic officers who had always viewed him as an abrasive outsider, now had the ultimate ammunition to destroy him. He must have realized during those long, sleepless nights on the ocean that his entire life had been a fragile performance. The myth of fighting Mac, the stoic, flawless Scottish warrior, was a suit of armor that had finally grown too heavy to carry. Beneath the medals and the gold braid was a deeply flawed, exhausted human being who had sought connection in the darkest, most forbidden corners of the colonial world. Whether those connections were born of genuine, albeit deeply illegal affection, or the predatory exploitation of his absolute power, the result was the same. The armor was cracked and the empire was preparing to tear him apart. When the ship finally docked in England in March 1903, the damp, biting chill of the British spring offered a grim welcome. Macdonald did not return to the cheering crowds and brass bands that had greeted him after Omdurman. He arrived in silence, slipping into London like a fugitive. His first and only imperative was to report to the War Office to face his superiors. The man waiting for him was Field Marshal Lord Roberts, the commander-in-chief of the forces. This was the same Lord Roberts who, decades earlier, had looked at a bloody, defiant color sergeant after the disaster of Majuba Hill and handed him an officer's commission. Roberts had been the architect of Macdonald's miraculous rise. Now, he was tasked with orchestrating his ruin. The meeting at the War Office was brief, cold, and entirely devoid of the camaraderie that usually exists between veterans of the Imperial campaigns. Roberts did not offer sympathy, nor did he offer a defense. He operated with the ruthless pragmatism required to manage a global empire. Roberts informed Macdonald that the allegations from Ceylon were too specific, too numerous, and too damaging to ignore. The highest levels of the British government, including King Edward VII himself, had been briefed on the situation. There would be no royal intervention, no quiet retirement to a country estate, and no sweeping the matter under the rug. The establishment had closed its ranks, and Macdonald was firmly on the outside. Roberts delivered the final devastating order. Macdonald was to return immediately to Ceylon. He was to face a general court-martial. He would stand before a tribunal of his peers, officers who already despised his working-class roots, and answer to the charges of sexual abuse against the local boys and the sons of colonial officials. Walking out of the War Office and onto the gray streets of London, the trap completely closed around him. A court-martial meant public exposure on a scale the world had rarely seen. The Victorian and Edwardian press, heavily reliant on sensationalism, would feast upon the details. The boy's letter would be read into the public record. The 70 witnesses would testify to the specific, sordid realities of what the general had done behind closed doors in the tropics. The scandal would not merely ruin him, it would retroactively poison every victory he had ever won. The British public, who had placed his portrait on their mantelpieces and taught their children to revere his name, would recoil in absolute disgust. He would be stripped of his rank, his knighthood, and his liberty. He would likely face years of hard labor in a severe Victorian prison, suffering the same agonizing fate as Oscar Wilde, but amplified by the horrifying nature of the pederasty charges. But worst of all, he would destroy the myth of the Scottish hero. The working-class boys who had looked at his life and believed that they, too, could rise above their station would see their idol exposed as a predator. The sheer terror of this impending public annihilation broke the iron will of Fighting Mac. He could not face the trial. He could not look his accusers in the eye in a crowded courtroom. He left London shortly after the meeting. He did not head for the ports to take a ship back to the Indian Ocean. Instead, he boarded a train for the coast and crossed the English Channel to France. He arrived in Paris and checked into the Hôtel Regina, a grand, imposing building situated on the Rue de Rivoli, just across from the Louvre. Paris offered him the one thing he desperately needed in his final hours: total anonymity. In London or Edinburgh, he could not walk down the street without being recognized. In Paris, he was just another wealthy British traveler passing through. For a few days, he existed in a state of suspended animation within the walls of room 105. He was a man stranded between the life he had lost and the death he was trying to summon the courage to embrace. The mundane details of the hotel, the soft carpets, the polite French staff, the view of the Parisian streets, must have felt entirely surreal to a man standing on the edge of the abyss. He was completely alone. He had no friends to call upon, and he could not reach out to his secret wife, Christina, without dragging her directly into the epicenter of the impending scandal. He was utterly isolated with his memories, his guilt, and the terrifying certainty of what he had to do. The final catalyst arrived on the morning of Wednesday, March 25th, 1903. Macdonald woke in his hotel room and eventually procured a copy of the morning newspaper. It was the Paris edition of the New York Herald. He unfolded the broadsheet, and his eyes fell upon a small but deadly article. The military had tried to keep the matter quiet until he was safely back in Ceylon, but the secret had proven too explosive to contain. Someone, somewhere, in the vast bureaucratic chain between Colombo and London, had spoken to a journalist. The headline and the subsequent lines of text explicitly stated that Major General Sir Hector Macdonald had been recalled from his post in Ceylon due to grave charges regarding immoral acts. The article did not detail the specific ages of the boys, but the coded language of the era was universally understood. The scandal had broken. The court of public opinion was already being convened. By tomorrow, the news would be on the front pages of every major newspaper in London, Edinburgh, and across the globe. Holding the newspaper in his hands, Macdonald understood that the grace period granted by the military had expired. The exposure he feared more than physical death had already begun. There was no longer any possibility of a quiet resolution, no chance of fighting the charges without dragging his entire life through the mud of a global media circus. The establishment had fed him to the wolves, and the wolves had arrived. He retreated into the quiet sanctuary of his hotel room and locked the door. The man who had spent his life surviving violence now meticulously prepared to inflict it upon himself. He did not put on his military uniform. He chose to remain in his sleepwear. Perhaps it was a final subconscious shedding of the imperial identity that had ultimately destroyed him, a return to the vulnerable, ordinary man he had always been beneath the medals. He retrieved his weapon. It was a Browning pistol, a cold, heavy piece of engineering designed specifically to end human life. He had spent decades directing the fire of thousands of rifles, but this final engagement required an intimately personal application of force. Standing in the Parisian hotel room, Hector Macdonald crossed the final psychological threshold. He was not surrendering to an enemy force. He was executing a calculated tactical retreat to protect the only thing he had left, the frozen, static memory of his own heroism. He believed that by dying, he could seal the scandal before it fully erupted, forcing the Empire to remember him as a tragic casualty rather than a convicted predator. He raised the Browning pistol, pressed the cold steel barrel against his head, and pulled the trigger. The sharp, concussive crack of the gunshot shattered the morning calm of the Hotel Regina. It echoed down the elegant hallways, a sudden and violent intrusion of reality into the quiet luxury of the Parisian establishment. Within moments, hotel staff and guests rushed toward the sound. The locked door of room 105 was forced open. Inside, they found the lifeless body of the Empire's greatest living soldier collapsed on the floor, the pistol resting near his hand, the newspaper containing his ruin lying discarded nearby. The immediate aftermath of the gunshot was a masterclass in Imperial damage control. The French police were naturally involved, but the British embassy in Paris moved with terrifying speed to take control of the scene and the narrative. Frantic, encrypted telegrams were sent directly to the War Office in London and the highest levels of the government. The primary objective was no longer to punish Hector Macdonald. It was to manage the explosive fallout of his corpse. A public trial had been averted, but a suicide under such suspicious circumstances threatened to raise more questions than it answered. The machinery of the British establishment, which had ruthlessly pushed him toward this exact outcome, now immediately shifted gears to bury the truth alongside his body. The immediate aftermath of the gunshot in room 105 of the Hotel Regina was a frantic collision of French police procedure and panicked British Imperial damage control. As the smoke cleared and the local authorities documented the grim scene, the British embassy in Paris mobilized with a terrifying cold efficiency. Encrypted telegraph wires buzzed furiously across the English Channel, carrying the news directly to the War Office and the highest echelons of King Edward VII's government. The primary objective of the British establishment shifted instantly. They no longer had a disgraced general to prosecute. They had a highly radioactive corpse that threatened to ignite a global scandal. The military machinery that had so meticulously cornered Hector Macdonald now worked overtime to erase the context of his death. A public court-martial had been successfully averted by his suicide, but the manner of his passing raised entirely new, dangerous questions. Why would the great Fighting Mac, the invincible hero of Omdurman, kill himself in a Parisian hotel room? If the detailed truth of the Ceylon allegations, the exploitation of local boys, and the sons of colonial officials were fully confirmed by the government, it would shatter the moral authority of the empire and provoke outrage among the working classes who worshipped him. The establishment chose the path of absolute suppression. They decided to bury him quickly, quietly, and with as little official fanfare as possible. The logistics of returning a disgraced hero to his homeland were handled with the secrecy of a covert military operation. Macdonald's body was placed in a plain coffin and transported from Paris across the Channel. There was no military escort, no draped flag, and no honor guard waiting at the docks in England. He was treated not as a knight of the realm, but as a shameful secret being smuggled through the back door. The plan was to transport him by night train directly to Edinburgh and inter him at Dean Cemetery before the public even realized his body had returned to British soil. The War Office wanted the earth to swallow him up, taking the scandalous rumors with him. It was during this bleak, clandestine journey that the most tragic ghost of Macdonald's life finally stepped out from the shadows. Christina McDuncan, the woman he had secretly married nearly 2 decades prior, emerged to claim her husband's body. For her entire adult life, she had existed in a state of enforced invisibility, hidden away to protect his carefully constructed image as the stoic bachelor warrior. She'd endured his long absences, his emotional distance, and the heavy burden of a marriage that could never be acknowledged. Now, in the face of his absolute ruin, she was finally permitted to stand publicly as Lady Macdonald. The tragedy of her existence was profound. She was only allowed to claim her husband when the Empire had completely discarded him. Despite the government's desperate attempts at secrecy, you cannot easily hide the death of a national icon. The news of his suicide, coupled with the vague, damning rumors from the Parisian press, leaked into the British newspapers. By the time the train carrying his coffin arrived in Edinburgh in the final days of March 1903, the secret was out. The government had planned a quiet, early morning burial, attended only by his immediate, newly revealed family. They severely miscalculated the depth of the Scottish people's devotion. On March 30th, the establishment's plan for a silent erasure was entirely derailed by the working class of Scotland. Word spread through the tenements of Edinburgh, the shipyards of Glasgow, and the rural crofts of the Highlands. When the funeral procession began its journey toward Dean Cemetery, it was not met with silence, but with a spontaneous, overwhelming outpouring of public grief. Over 30,000 people lined the streets of Edinburgh. These were not aristocrats or politicians. They were the ordinary men and women who saw Macdonald as one of their own, a man who had proven that the poor could achieve greatness. The scene at the cemetery was one of profound, unscripted mourning. Thousands of floral tributes poured in from across the globe, sent by ordinary soldiers, Highland societies, and common citizens. Women wept openly, and hardened veterans stood in silent, stunned reverence. Yet the starkest feature of the funeral was the absolute absence of the British military establishment. Not a single high-ranking officer or government official attended. The empire he had bled for, the institution that had used him to conquer nations, sent no one to see him lowered into the ground. The contrast was devastating. Abandoned by the elite who had engineered his downfall, he was carried to his grave on a wave of pure, unfiltered devotion from the people he had left behind. In the aftermath, the British government released a heavily sanitized report to bury the truth. The international press, however, published the grim specifics. Yet the Scottish working class fiercely rejected the allegations. Refusing to believe their working class icon was a predator, they framed his downfall as a malicious conspiracy orchestrated by the jealous English aristocracy. This collective denial manifested in stone. Funded by the pennies of the poor, a colossal monument was erected in Dingwall to honor a man the government desperately wanted forgotten. Today, modern historical research into colonial archives demands we confront the darker reality of his unchecked power in Ceylon. The towering monument to Fighting Mac still reaches toward the Scottish sky, but it casts a long, complicated shadow, a chilling reminder of the devastating price of living a lie and the deeply flawed human beings we place on our highest pedestals.